1772, America's darkest religious organization, where salvation is synonymous with slavery and death. In the forgotten archives of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, deep beneath the dust of the 18th century, lies a document that sends a shiver down the spine of anyone who reads it. The 1772 investigative report on the Community for the Salvation of Souls reveals the systematic torture and exploitation of 312 immigrants and locals over a period of 24 years. The most horrifying aspect was not the brutality described, but the fact that 3 siblings, William, Elizabeth, and Thomas Whitaker, had convinced an entire community that their monstrous acts were a divine mission from God. The official records were sealed by order of the Colonial Council, buried so deeply that most historians have never known of the Whitaker family's reign of terror. But tonight, we will uncover the truth about America's darkest religious cult, a place where salvation was just another word for slavery and death. Before we continue the story of the Whitaker family and their horrifying chapel, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the darkest, most chilling stories from America's hidden history. If you are fascinated by the shadows that lurk behind our nation's past, please subscribe and ring the notification bell. And I'd love to know. Comment below and let me know what state or city you're listening from. Are there any dark legends from your area that we should investigate? The story of the Whitaker family begins not with madness, but with an appearance of sincere piety, which makes their crimes all the more chilling. Pennsylvania, in the 1740s, was a land of religious reform and immigrant influx. The First Great Awakening had swept through the colonies, giving birth to countless new sects, moral societies, and communities dedicated to the reformation of the human soul. This was an era when Christians believed that any deviation from moral purity could be corrected through prayer, discipline, and unwavering faith in God's providence. Lancaster County, situated along the Susquehanna River Valley, was an emblem of this moral crusade. The town of Lancaster boasted 9 churches, 3 temperance societies, and a growing reputation as a beacon of Christian faith. The rolling green hills were covered with the farms of German and English settlers, families who had maintained strict Puritan traditions for generations. These were people who believed that moral decay was a contagion that spread like the plague, and that drastic measures were sometimes necessary to protect the spiritual health of society. It was into this fervent religious atmosphere that William Whitaker arrived in the spring of 1748, along with his sister Elizabeth and younger brother Thomas. William was a tall, stern man with deep-set black eyes and a prematurely grey beard that made him look prophetic. At 42, he carried the authority of a man who had wrestled with sin and emerged victorious. Elizabeth, 4 years younger, possessed a cold beauty like granite, pale skin, high cheekbones, and lips that rarely offered a warm smile. Thomas, only 28, had a soft face and gentle demeanor that made him seem angelic, a quality that would later prove to be lethally deceptive. The Whitaker siblings arrived in Lancaster County with impeccable credentials. William presented letters of introduction from ministers in Virginia, praising his innovative approach to soul-saving. He spoke eloquently of his mission to establish a community where lost immigrants and sinners could find redemption through structured labor and spiritual guidance. The idea was not unfamiliar. Religious communities had sprung up throughout the English colonies in the 1732nd and 1740s, responding to anxieties about crime, immigration, and moral decline. What set William's proposal apart was its emphasis on salvation through holy labor, a combination of physical work, Bible study, and rituals he called purification to cleanse the soul of its impurities. Local ministers and officials were impressed by his theological sophistication and his dedication to Christian charity. When William purchased a large, abandoned farm on the outskirts of Lancaster, a former Dutch estate with 62 acres of surrounding woodlands, the community saw it as a sign from God. The farm itself seemed perfectly suited to William's vision. A large stone barn built in 1705 with thick stone walls, small windows, and a layout that could easily be converted into dormitories, workshops, and administrative quarters. Most importantly, it had a system of cellars that William claimed would be ideal for meditation chambers. where the most troubled souls could pray and repent in isolation. Throughout the summer of 1748, the Whitakers worked tirelessly to prepare the community. William oversaw the renovations, installing heavy locks and bars on the windows to protect the residents from the temptation to flee before their redemption was complete. Elizabeth organized the daily routines, designing a schedule of prayer, labor, and meals that would control every moment of the day. Thomas, who had studied theology at a small seminary in Maryland, drafted the spiritual curriculum that would form the basis of their therapy. The local community watched these preparations with approval and anticipation. Local ministers praised William's comprehensive approach to soul saving, emphasizing his Bible-based therapy and his commitment to individualized treatment. The local magistrate, Sir Elias Thornton, was particularly impressed with William's detailed plans and his willingness to take on even the most difficult cases, individuals whom other communities had deemed beyond saving. By October 1748, the Community for the Salvation of Souls was ready to receive its first resident. The local newspaper, the Lancaster Herald, ran an article praising the institution as a beacon of Christian hope for society's most lost souls. The article noted that the Whitakers refused funding from the colonial government, relying instead on private donations and what William called contribution fees from families seeking their redemptive services. The first arrival came on a chilly November morning. Anna Klein, a two-year-old German immigrant girl, accused of theft and lewd behavior. Her father, a poor farmer, had paid a substantial fee for a one-year program he believed would save his daughter. As Anna disappeared behind the heavy wooden doors of the chapel, her father left with the conviction that he had fulfilled his Christian duty. He would never see his daughter again, though he would continue to receive monthly letters in her handwriting, reassuring him that her salvation was proceeding according to God's will. What he didn't know was that Anna Klein had just become the first victim in a monstrous scheme that would horrify even the most seasoned investigators when it was discovered nearly 2.5 decades later. The Community for the Salvation of Souls was about to become something far more sinister than anyone in Lancaster County could have imagined. A place where piety would serve as the perfect mask for unspeakable cruelty and exploitation. The transformation of Anna Klein began only hours after her arrival at the Whitaker Chapel, though it would be 1772 before anyone understood the true nature of what the family called their purification therapy. On that November evening in 1748, as the cold winter wind whistled through the cracks in the chapel's stone walls, Anna experienced what she would later describe in a sworn testimony 24 years later as the first gate into damnation. William Whitaker greeted Anna in the main drawing room, a space that retained its colonial solemnity with heavy wooden ceiling beams and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall, casting flickering shadows on the religious paintings and biblical verses carved directly into the walls. William was dressed in simple black, his stern features softened by a facade of compassion as he explained the community's mission to save her immortal soul. "Miss Klein," he said, in a tone that carried the resonance of well-practiced sermons, "you come to us as Mary Magdalene came to our Savior, broken by sin but yearning for redemption. Your Father has entrusted us with your soul, and we do not take this sacred responsibility lightly. The path to purification is arduous, but those who complete our mission will be cleansed of their defilement, ready to return to their rightful place in the Christian community." Elizabeth Whitaker appeared as if summoned by some invisible signal, her cold beauty accentuated by the severe black dress she wore, its high collar fastened with a silver cross. She moved with the measured steps of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Her cold gray eyes scrutinized Anna with the calculating gaze of a farmer assessing newly purchased livestock. "The first step in salvation therapy," Elizabeth explained, "is to renounce earthly vanities and embrace holy simplicity. You will surrender all of your personal belongings, including the clothes you are wearing, as these material things represent a connection to your sinful past. We will provide you with suitable garments that reflect your current status as a penitent soul seeking redemption." Anna's protests were met with feigned patience. Thomas Whitaker, who had been standing quietly in the shadows, stepped forward with the gentle demeanor that had so charmed the local ministers. His soft brown eyes radiated a divine compassion that seemed to promise salvation for even the most lost souls. "I understand your fear, Anna," he said, using her first name with the familiar intimacy of a spiritual guide. The devil whispers in your ear, telling you to resist the very salvation you have come to seek. But we have witnessed this struggle countless times, and we know how to help you overcome these sinful temptations. Trust in the Lord and trust in us. We are His servants, dedicated to your redemption. What happened next would haunt Anna for the rest of her life, though she would not speak of it publicly until 1772, when investigators finally uncovered the truth about the Whitakers' methods. She was led to what William called the preparation room, a small windowless chamber in the chapel's cellar where new residents underwent their initial purification ritual. The room had been carved out of the original root cellar, its stone walls seeping a cold dampness that William's attempts to dignify it could not conceal. Candles were the only source of light, their flames creating an atmosphere that William claimed was conducive to spiritual reflection. Religious iconography covered every surface: crosses, biblical verses, and crude woodcuts depicting the torments of sinful souls and the rewards of divine salvation. Anna was instructed to remove her traveling dress and undergarments, replacing them with a simple grey shift embroidered with the words "Penitent Soul" across the chest. Her hair was cut short, not cruelly shaved, but trimmed to a length that William claimed would discourage the vanity that had contributed to her moral fall. Her few coins and personal letters were placed in a wooden box that William said would be returned to her upon the completion of her redemption. But it was what happened after this seemingly routine intake process that revealed the true nature of the Whitaker community. As Anna stood shivering in the thin shift, Elizabeth began what she called an examination for spiritual defilement, a procedure that involved an intimate physical inspection under the guise of determining the extent of Anna's spiritual corruption. Sin leaves its marks upon the body as well as the soul, Elizabeth explained, her voice carrying the mechanical tone of someone reciting a well-rehearsed script. We must understand the full scope of your moral decay before we can design an appropriate salvation therapy. This examination is conducted with the utmost Christian solemnity and is essential for your spiritual recovery. What followed was a systematic violation disguised as medical necessity, conducted with a clinical coldness that was somehow more horrifying than overt brutality. Anna's body was examined, measured, and documented in a leather-bound ledger that Elizabeth meticulously maintained. Questions were asked about her past, the marks on her body, and her physical responses to various forms of touch, all under the guise of assessing her moral decay and designing appropriate purification therapies. The psychological component of this initial intake was just as devastating. Thomas Whitaker conducted what he called a spiritual interview, using his theological knowledge to probe Anna's deepest fears, desires, and shames. He possessed an uncanny ability to identify psychological vulnerabilities, asking questions that seemed designed to strip away her sense of self-worth and replace it with an absolute dependence on the Whitakers' guidance. "Tell me of the moment you first felt sinful desire," Thomas prompted, his voice retaining its gentle, pastoral tone, even as his questions grew increasingly invasive. "Help me understand how the devil first entered your soul, so that we may work together to cast him out. Remember, nothing you say can shock or surprise me. I have heard the confessions of hundreds of souls, and I understand the particular ways in which Satan tempts the human heart." By the time Anna was finally allowed to rest in the small dormitory room she would share with 3 others, she had been psychologically and physically violated in ways that left her questioning her own perception of reality. The Whitakers had asserted their absolute authority over her body and mind, while maintaining the facade of Christian compassion and spiritual guidance. She was no longer Anna Klein, an immigrant from Germany. She was a penitent soul whose identity now belonged to her religious saviors. What Anna could not have known was that she had just experienced the first stage of a systematic process that the Whitakers had perfected through careful study of their victims' psychological responses. Every aspect of the intake procedure had been designed to break down her sense of individual identity and replace it with total submission to their authority. The religious framework both provided the justification for their actions and shielded them from outside scrutiny. Who would dare to question the methods of devout Christians working to save lost souls? As Anna lay awake that first night, listening to the muffled sobs of her roommates and the strange sounds that echoed through the chapel's corridors. She began to realize that the community for the salvation of souls was something entirely different from what her father had believed he was purchasing for her salvation. But it was already too late to escape what the Whitakers had planned for her redemption. The machinery of spiritual degradation had claimed another victim, and the real education of Anna Klein had only just begun. As winter settled over Lancaster County in late 1748, the Community for the Salvation of Souls began to establish its daily rhythms, and with them, the carefully orchestrated horror that would define the next 2+ decades. Anna Klein's experience had been the template. Every person who entered the Whitaker Chapel underwent the same process of systematic psychological and physical domination, all disguised as intensive spiritual therapy. The genius of the Whitakers lay not in their brutality, but in their understanding of how religious authority could provide the perfect cover for exploitation. William had studied the methods of legitimate religious communities, identifying the aspects of their programs that could be twisted to serve his own purposes. Morning prayers became opportunities for psychological manipulation. Bible study sessions were used to reinforce messages of human depravity and the necessity of suffering as purification. Physical labor, supposedly intended to instill discipline and humility, became a means of physically weakening the residents' resistance while generating profits through the sale of their products. By the spring of 1749, the community housed 18 people, ranging from European immigrants to local residents, accused of sins like theft or heresy. They came from families across Pennsylvania and Virginia, who paid steep fees for what they believed to be intensive salvation therapy, never questioning why their loved ones' letters home had a similar tone and content, or why visits were consistently discouraged as disruptive to the spiritual healing process. The daily schedule at the Community for the Salvation of Souls followed a timetable William had designed to maximize both control and productivity. Residents woke at 4 a.m. for prayer, led by Thomas Whitaker in the converted chapel. His sermons focused relentlessly on themes of human depravity, the need for submission to God's authority, and the particular ways in which human sinful nature made them susceptible to error. Prayer was followed by a breakfast of thin oatmeal and water, then 8 hours of labor in the community's workshops. The residents produced wrought iron goods, woven textiles, and handcrafted leather items that Elizabeth sold to wealthy merchants in the region. The quality of their work was exceptional. Fear and desperation, it seemed, could inspire an incredible attention to detail. The income from these sales, combined with the fees paid by families, made the Community for the Salvation of Souls enormously profitable. Though the Whitakers maintained the fiction that they operated their community purely as a Christian charity, but it was the evening activities that revealed the true nature of the Whitaker enterprise. After supper and prayers, residents were subjected to what William called individual spiritual therapy, sessions that took place in the chapel's cellars and involved procedures that no legitimate religious community would ever have sanctioned. These sessions were presented as essential components of the salvation process, necessary steps to purge the residents of their moral impurities. The Whitaker Chapel's cellar system had been extensively modified during the fall of 1748, transformed from simple storage vaults into a complex of rooms that served the family's darker purposes. The largest chamber, which William called the Sanctuary of Purification, featured religious iconography alongside restraint devices that he claimed were necessary to help souls overcome their sinful impulses during intensive spiritual counseling. Smaller stone alcoves served as private rooms where individual therapy sessions took place, with stone walls thick enough to muffle any sounds that might disturb the community's spiritual atmosphere. Anna Klein would later testify that these evening sessions began with what appeared to be legitimate counseling. Thomas Whitaker would discuss her spiritual progress, asking probing questions about her thoughts and feelings, identifying areas where further purification work was needed. But these conversations were, in fact, sophisticated psychological assessments designed to determine the most effective methods of coercion and control for each individual. Thomas possessed an almost preternatural ability to understand our fears. Anna would tell investigators in 1772, He could look at you and know exactly what you were thinking, exactly what would break your spirit or bend you to his will. He used his knowledge of the Bible and his understanding of our deepest shames to convince us that to resist their methods was to resist God's will for our salvation. The physical aspects of these therapy sessions were presented as medical procedures necessary for moral purification. Elizabeth Whitaker, who claimed to have knowledge of human health matters, conducted what she called spiritual examinations to assess each person's progress toward recovery. These examinations involved intimate procedures that served no legitimate medical purpose, but were presented as essential components of the purification process. Mrs. Whitaker explained that sin created physical impurities that could only be cleansed through specific treatments. Anna testified. She said that our bodies were temples that had been defiled by our moral decay, and that restoring our spiritual purity required intensive physical cleansing. We believed her because she spoke with such authority, and because we had been taught to believe that our suffering was part of God's plan for our salvation. The true horror of the Whitaker's system only became apparent gradually, as the psychological manipulation deepened and the residents' resistance was systematically broken down. By the summer of 1749, the original 18 residents had been joined by 10 more, creating a population large enough for William to implement the most sinister aspect of his operation, what he privately called his grace program. The Whitakers had discovered that there were men who were willing to pay significant sums for what William euphemistically called private prayer sessions with the residents. These men were introduced as benefactors of the community, devout Christians who wanted to contribute to the salvation of lost souls through individual counseling and prayer. They were told that their financial contributions supported the community's charitable work and that their spiritual guidance helped to accelerate the residents' path to redemption. In reality, these men were purchasing sexual access to the residents under the guise of religious charity. William had cultivated a network of wealthy clients throughout Pennsylvania and Maryland, men who were drawn by the combination of sexual gratification and moral justification that his system offered. They could indulge their desires while believing they were contributing to Christian charity and the moral improvement of society. The residents were told that these sessions were essential components of their salvation process, opportunities to practice the submissive behavior that would be expected of them when they returned to society. Resistance was met with harsher punishments and extended stays in the community, while compliance was rewarded with slightly better treatment and promises of eventual release. The psychological pressure was intense. People who had been systematically broken down over months of manipulation found themselves unable to distinguish between salvation and exploitation. We wanted to believe that our suffering had meaning, Anna would explain to investigators. The Whitakers had convinced us that every humiliation, every violation, was bringing us closer to spiritual purity. We clung to that belief because the alternative, to accept that we were simply being tortured and exploited, was too horrible to admit. As 1,749 turned into 1,750, the Community for the Salvation of Souls had established itself as a respected institution within Lancaster County's network of religious communities. Local ministers praised the Whitakers' dedication to Christian charity, noting the substantial donations they made to church-building funds and missionary work. Magistrate Thornton regularly referred families dealing with moral issues to the community, impressed by what appeared to be the Whitakers' success in redeeming even the most difficult cases. But beneath this veneer of Christian virtue, something monstrous had taken root. The Whitakers had created a system that combined religious manipulation, psychological torture, and sexual exploitation into a perfectly functioning machine of human degradation. They had learned how to identify and exploit their victims' deepest vulnerabilities, using faith and shame as weapons to maintain absolute control over people who had nowhere else to turn. The shadow of the past grew longer with each passing month as more people disappeared into the Whitaker community, and the family's network of wealthy clients continued to expand. What had begun as the personal nightmare of Anna Klein was becoming a systematic enterprise that would ultimately destroy hundreds of lives while hiding behind the sacred protection of religious authority. And yet, the worst was still to come. The year 1752 brought subtle but significant changes to the Community for the Salvation of Souls, changes that might have alarmed any outside observer who understood their true meaning. The Whitaker operation was expanding in both scale and sophistication, evolving from a crude system of exploitation into something far more organized and terrifying. What had begun as opportunistic abuse was becoming an institution with its own internal logic, its own rules, and its own terrible efficiency. The most visible change was the construction of additional buildings on the farm property. William Whitaker announced that the success of their salvation program had necessitated an expansion to accommodate the growing number of families seeking their services. Throughout the spring and summer, local craftsmen worked to erect what appeared to be additional dormitories and workshops, buildings that William claimed would allow them to serve more souls while maintaining the intimate, congregational atmosphere that had made their program so effective. In reality, these new structures served a much darker purpose. The building that William called the Advanced Grace Center was actually a sophisticated facility designed to accommodate the most lucrative aspect of his operation, the Grace program that was generating substantial income from his growing network of wealthy clients. Private rooms with separate entrances allowed clients to visit without being observed by local residents, while soundproofed walls ensured that no disturbing noises escaped. The second new building, labeled as the Special Meditation Wing, was designed for what William privately called his special cases, individuals who had proven particularly resistant to the community's methods or who had attempted to escape. This facility featured smaller, more secure cells where the most stubborn residents could be subjected to intensive spiritual guidance until their resistance was completely broken. The building's basement included what William euphemistically called the purification vaults, where the most extreme therapy sessions took place. Anna Klein, now in her 4th year at the Community for the Salvation of Souls, watched the construction of these new facilities with a growing sense of dread. Her initial shock and resistance had been systematically worn down over years of psychological manipulation, physical abuse, and carefully orchestrated shame. She had learned to comply with the Whitakers' demands, not because she believed in their methods, but because resistance brought punishments that were exponentially worse than submission. By 1752, I no longer recognized myself, Anna would later testify. The young woman who had arrived at that community was gone, replaced by someone whose only thoughts were of survival and the avoidance of punishment. I had seen what happened to those who continued to resist. Some disappeared entirely, supposedly transferred to other communities or returned to their families, but we never heard from them again. Others were kept in the purification vaults for weeks at a time, emerging as empty shells who would agree to anything rather than be sent back there. The disappearances Anna mentioned had begun in late 1751, though the true scale of what was happening would not be understood for many years. People who proved too troublesome or who threatened to expose the community's methods were dealt with through what William called his Holy Arrangement Program. Families were told that their loved ones had been transferred to specialized communities better equipped to handle their particular moral failings, or that they had completed their redemption and been placed in positions of service on plantations in the southern colonies. In reality, these people were being sold into indentured servitude to plantations in the Carolinas, or simply murdered when they posed too much of a risk to the Whitaker operation. William had developed relationships with human traffickers who were willing to pay substantial sums for individuals who had been broken by years of systematic abuse. These transactions were conducted with the same business-like efficiency that characterized every aspect of the Whitaker enterprise. The most chilling aspect of these disappearances was the way they were seamlessly integrated into the community's normal operations. Other residents were told that the missing individuals had graduated from the program and returned to their families, or that they had been blessed with the opportunity to serve God in other roles. Letters supposedly from these individuals would arrive periodically, describing their happiness in their new lives and thanking the Whitakers for their spiritual guidance. These letters were actually written by Thomas Whitaker, who had developed a remarkable skill for mimicking different handwriting styles and capturing the vocal patterns that made each letter seem authentic. He had studied each person's writing samples during their intake process, creating detailed notes on vocabulary, sentence structure, and personal idiosyncrasies that allowed him to produce convincing forgeries for months or even years after their disappearance. Thomas was the most frightening of the three, Anna would recall. William was brutal and Elizabeth was cold, but Thomas was something worse. He was the devil in an angel's disguise. He could look at you with those gentle brown eyes and speak in that soft, compassionate voice while describing the most terrible things as acts of Christian charity. He convinced us that our suffering was sacred, that our degradation was actually elevation, that our despair was really hope in disguise. By the fall of 1752, the Community for the Salvation of Souls housed 41 people, making it one of the largest religious communities in Pennsylvania. The expansion had been financed through the profits from the Whitakers' various enterprises, the sale of goods produced by the residents, the fees paid by families, and the substantial sums generated from the Grace program. William had also begun investing in other ventures, using his profits to purchase properties throughout Lancaster County and establish business relationships that would provide additional sources of income. The Whitakers' growing wealth and apparent success had made them prominent figures in Lancaster County's religious community. William was invited to speak at ministerial conferences about his innovative methods of soul saving, while Elizabeth became a sought-after advisor for other women involved in charitable work. Thomas was being considered for ordination as a minister. His gentle demeanor and apparent theological sophistication had made him a favorite among local church leaders. This public success provided the perfect cover for the increasingly sophisticated criminal enterprise operating within the Community for the Salvation of Souls. The Whitakers had learned how to present the exact image their community wanted to see: devout Christians dedicated to the challenging work of redeeming souls, successful innovators who had discovered effective methods for saving even the most hardened sinners. But beneath this carefully constructed veneer, the reality was becoming ever more monstrous. The Whitakers had perfected their system of exploitation, developing methods of psychological control that could break even the strongest personalities within a matter of months. They had established networks for disposing of troublesome residents and creating forged correspondence that convinced families their loved ones were thriving in their new lives. They had created a criminal organization that combined religious manipulation, sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and murder into a smoothly functioning enterprise that generated enormous profits while hiding behind the protection of religious authority. The most terrifying aspect of their success was the way they had completely convinced themselves that their actions were justified. William genuinely believed that he was providing a valuable service to society by removing sinners from their communities and putting them to productive use. Elizabeth saw herself as a pioneering researcher in human psychology, developing innovative methods for controlling and directing behavior. Thomas remained convinced that he was serving God's will by helping lost souls find their proper place in the divine order. This self-justification made them far more dangerous than simple criminals motivated by greed or cruelty. The Whitakers operated with the absolute conviction that their cause was righteous, that their methods were necessary, and that anyone who resisted them was resisting God's plan for moral order. They had created their own distorted theology, transforming every cruelty into an act of charity, every violation into a sacrament, every murder into a merciful release. As winter approached in 1752, Anna Klein and the other residents of the Community for the Salvation of Souls faced the grim reality that there might be no escape from the nightmare they had entered. The Whitakers' power was growing, their methods were becoming more sophisticated, and their operation was expanding in ways that suggested they intended to continue their work indefinitely. The shadow of the past had become a darkness that threatened to consume everything in its path, and the worst horrors were still ahead. The winter of 1771 brought unexpected visitors to Lancaster County, visitors whose presence would ultimately unravel the Whitakers' carefully constructed empire of exploitation. But first, their arrival would trigger the most violent and desperate phase in the history of the Community for the Salvation of Souls, as William, Elizabeth, and Thomas Whitaker realized that their perfect system might finally be facing serious scrutiny. The visitors were representatives of the Colonial Council of Pennsylvania, an authoritative body tasked with investigating reports of irregularities at religious communities and charitable institutions across the colony. The council had been spurred into action by a series of scandals involving the abuse of followers and questionable doctrines at several sects, and their mandate was to conduct a thorough review of any institution that received public referrals or drew members from multiple regions. Representative Jonathan Hale, a prominent lawyer from Philadelphia, arrived in Lancaster on a cold November morning with 2 assistants and a briefcase full of documented concerns about the Community for the Salvation of Souls. Several families had contacted the council with questions about their loved ones' extended stays in the community, while others had raised concerns about the lack of visitation opportunities and the suspicious similarity of the letters received from their relatives. We had received 12 formal inquiries regarding the Whitaker community by the end of 1771. Representative Hale would later write in his official report, while none of the complainants made specific allegations of wrongdoing, the pattern of concerns was disturbing enough to warrant an investigation. Families were being told that their relatives required extended periods of salvation with no clear timeline for completion, and several reported that attempts to visit had been discouraged or denied altogether. William Whitaker received word of the council's arrival through his network of contacts within Lancaster's official community. Magistrate Thornton, who had referred many cases to the Community for the Salvation of Souls, sent a discreet warning that allowed William time to prepare for what he hoped would be a routine inspection. What William did not realize was that Representative Hale was far more thorough than previous investigators, and that he was prepared to examine not just the community's physical facilities, but its financial records and its salvation methods as well. News of the impending inspection threw the Whitakers into a state of barely controlled panic. For more than 20 years, they had operated with complete confidence in the invulnerability of their system, secure in the knowledge that their religious authority provided the perfect protection from outside scrutiny. The possibility that investigators from the Colonial Council might uncover their true activities forced them to confront the reality that their empire of exploitation might be more fragile than they had believed. William immediately began implementing what he called his emergency protocol, procedures he had developed to conceal the most incriminating aspects of their operation should outside scrutiny ever become necessary. The purification vaults were quickly converted to look like simple storage areas, with religious iconography and restraint devices removed or disguised as legitimate agricultural tools. The private rooms in the Advanced Grace Center were reconfigured to resemble additional dormitories, while records of client access were hidden or destroyed entirely. More disturbingly were the measures taken regarding the residents themselves. Those who had been in the community the longest, who had witnessed the most extreme aspects of the Whitakers' methods, were quickly transferred to what William called satellite communities. In reality, these individuals were being sold off or disposed of altogether, as William could not risk having witnesses who might contradict the official narrative about the community's salvation methods. Anna Klein, now in her 23rd year at the Community for the Salvation of Souls, was among the residents selected for emergency transfer. She had been designated too dangerous to remain during the inspection, her knowledge of the community's true activities making her an intolerable liability. On the night before Representative Hale's scheduled visit, Anna and 9 other long-term residents were loaded into covered wagons and transported to destinations they would never know. "I knew that night we were going to die," Anna would later testify. They had always been careful to maintain the fiction that we might eventually be saved, but there was something in William's eyes that told me the pretense was over. We were no longer valuable assets. We had become dangerous witnesses who knew too much about their methods. But Anna's fate would be different from that of her fellow captives, saved by a combination of circumstances that not even the Whitakers could have anticipated. The wagon carrying her to her supposed destination suffered a broken axle during the journey, forcing her guards to seek shelter at a farm owned by Abram Hess, a Mennonite farmer who had long suspected that something was wrong at the Whitaker community. Hess had been troubled by the reports he had heard about the Community for the Salvation of Souls, stories that did not align with his understanding of Christian charity and moral guidance. When he saw Anna's condition, her obvious malnutrition, the evidence of physical abuse, and her terrified demeanor, he recognized immediately that she was a victim, not a willing participant in any legitimate salvation program. "Mr. Hess saved my life that night," Anna would recall. "When he saw my condition, he knew immediately that something terrible was happening at the Whitaker community. Instead of allowing my guards to continue their journey, he insisted that I remain at his farm to recover from what he called obvious mistreatment. He sent word to others of his faith, who understood how to help the vulnerable escape from dangerous situations." Anna's rescue occurred just hours before Representative Hale began his inspection at the Community for the Salvation of Souls. William Whitaker greeted the investigator with his usual combination of religious authority and apparent transparency, confident that his emergency protocols had successfully concealed the most incriminating evidence of the true nature of his operation. He gave a tour of the facilities, introduced Hale to carefully selected residents who had been coached to give positive testimonies, and presented financial records that appeared to document a legitimate, charitable institution. But Representative Hale was more perceptive than William had anticipated. Despite the Whitakers' preparations, he noticed details that suggested the community was not what it seemed. The residents he interviewed seemed unusually fearful and gave answers that sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The community's financial records showed a level of income that seemed inconsistent with a purely charitable operation, while the physical modifications to the chapel raised questions about the true purpose of some of the rooms and cellars. Most disturbing was the pattern Hale observed in the community's population records. More than 20 people had supposedly completed their salvation and been successfully placed in positions of service in the previous year alone. Yet, none of their families reported having received word of their loved ones' new employment. When Hale requested to see the correspondence from these supposedly redeemed individuals, Thomas Whitaker produced letters that seemed authentic but contained subtle inconsistencies that raised the representative's suspicions. The handwriting varied in ways that suggested different authors, yet the vocabulary and sentence structure were remarkably similar. Hale noted in his preliminary report, "When I requested to speak with the families who had received these letters, Mr. Whitaker claimed that confidentiality requirements prevented him from providing contact information. This explanation seemed inconsistent with the community's stated mission of restoring souls to society." As Hale's inspection continued into its second day, William Whitaker realized that his emergency protocols might not be sufficient to satisfy the representative's scrutiny. The investigator was asking increasingly pointed questions about the community's methods, demanding access to areas that had been hastily converted from their true purpose, and expressing concern about the psychological state of the current residents. Even more alarming was the news that reached William through his network of contacts. Anna Klein had been found at Abram Hess's farm and was now under the protection of the Mennonite community, who were known for their willingness to challenge the authority of established institutions. If Anna began to speak about her experiences at the Community for the Salvation of Souls, she could provide testimony that would shatter the Whitakers' carefully constructed veneer. The pressure of potential exposure triggered a state of near insanity in the three Whitaker siblings. William, who had always maintained tight control over every aspect of their operation, began to make increasingly desperate decisions. He dispatched men to retrieve Anna from the Hess farm, instructing them to use whatever force was necessary to prevent her from speaking to investigators. He also began making preparations to eliminate Representative Hale himself, reasoning that the investigator's death could be blamed on highwaymen or the accidents common to winter travel. Elizabeth's reaction to the crisis revealed the depths of her psychological detachment from normal human emotion. Instead of showing concern about potential exposure, she became obsessed with preserving her detailed records of the residents' psychological and physical responses to their salvation methods. She spent hours burning documents that might incriminate the family, while carefully preserving what she considered her most valuable research data, apparently believing that her work had real scientific value that justified the suffering it had caused. Thomas's reaction was perhaps the most disturbing. The gentle, pastoral demeanor that had been so effective in manipulating residents and winning the community's trust began to crack under the pressure, revealing glimpses of the calculating predator beneath. He began conducting what he called emergency spiritual guidance sessions with the remaining residents, using increasingly extreme methods to ensure their silence about the community's true activities. Mr. Thomas became terrifying in those last days, one of the surviving residents would later testify. The mask of compassion he had always worn began to slip, and we could see the hatred and contempt he had for all of us. He told us that if anyone spoke to the investigators about our misunderstandings of the Salvation Program, we would be sent to places that would make the Community for the Salvation of Souls seem like paradise. Just when we thought we had seen the extent of the Whitakers' depravity, their desperation would push them to acts that would shock even the most hardened investigators, who finally uncovered the full scale of their crimes. If this story is sending a chill down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Let's find out together what happened when Representative Hale's investigation collided with Anna Klein's testimony. The collision between Anna's rescue and Representative Hale's investigation would trigger a chain of events that would ultimately expose one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in American colonial history. But first, the Whitakers would make one last desperate attempt to protect their empire of exploitation, an attempt that would reveal the true depths of their monstrosity and lead to consequences that would echo through Lancaster County for generations. On the morning of the 22nd of November 1771, as Representative Hale prepared to expand his investigation based on the disturbing inconsistencies he had observed, word reached the Community for the Salvation of Souls that Anna Klein was not only alive but was actively cooperating with the Mennonite community, who were documenting her testimony. This news struck the Whitakers like a thunderbolt, shattering their confidence that the situation could still be controlled through their usual methods of manipulation and intimidation. William's immediate response was to dispatch his most trusted associates, men who had served as supervisors and enforcers throughout the community's operation, to neutralize what he saw as an existential threat to everything they had built. These were not gentle religious guides, but hardened thugs who had been drawn to the Whitaker operation by the combination of steady pay and the opportunity to abuse vulnerable people with impunity. But the Mennonite community protecting Anna was not defenseless. Abram Hess and his neighbors were part of a close-knit network that had developed sophisticated methods for protecting those in distress from those who would silence them. When William's men arrived at the Hess farm, they found it defended by armed farmers who had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. The attempted raid on the Hess farm became the first act of open violence in an escalating conflict that shattered the Whitakers' veneer of religious respectability. When Representative Hale learned that armed men from the Community for the Salvation of Souls had attacked a Mennonite farm in an attempt to seize a potential witness, he immediately understood that his investigation had uncovered something far more serious than financial irregularities or questionable salvation methods. Meanwhile, back at the Whitaker Chapel, the remaining residents found themselves trapped in an increasingly volatile situation. As the family's desperation pushed them to abandon all pretense of maintaining their salvation mission, Thomas Whitaker began conducting what he called final purification rites, sessions that seemed designed more to traumatize the residents into complete silence than to serve any therapeutic purpose. His gentle demeanor had been completely replaced by open threats and uncontrolled violence. He told us that if the community was forced to close, we would all be transferred to places where no one would ever find us. Eliza Schmidt, one of the few residents who survived to testify about this period, recalled. He described in detail what would happen to souls who betrayed their Christian benefactors, painting pictures of suffering that made our current situation seem merciful by comparison. Elizabeth Whitaker's response to the crisis was perhaps the most chillingly revealing aspect of the family's psychology. Instead of showing concern about potential criminal prosecution, she remained focused on what she considered her life's work, the systematic study and documentation of human psychological responses to various forms of manipulation and abuse. She spent the crisis period organizing her research notes and attempting to preserve what she saw as valuable scientific data. Mrs. Whitaker seemed to believe that history would vindicate her methods. Anna would later testify. She spoke of her work as if she were conducting important research that would benefit future generations. The idea that she was simply torturing innocent people for her own satisfaction seemed completely alien to her understanding of her own actions. As news of the confrontation at the Hess farm spread through Lancaster County, Representative Hale realized that he was dealing with a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond the Whitaker family themselves. The men who had attacked the Mennonite farm were not random criminals, but part of an organized network that had been operating under the protection of religious authority for years. This realization prompted him to request additional support from Philadelphia and to begin examining the connections between the Community for the Salvation of Souls and other individuals and institutions in the region. The subsequent investigation would eventually reveal that the Whitakers had been running a criminal empire that combined human trafficking, sexual exploitation, fraud, and murder into a sophisticated enterprise that had generated enormous profits while hiding behind a veneer of Christian charity. But before that full scale could be understood, the Whitakers would make one final, desperate attempt to destroy the evidence of their crimes and eliminate the witnesses who could testify against them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether decades of systematic abuse would finally be brought to justice, or whether the Whitakers' empire of exploitation would survive to continue destroying lives for years to come. The fight for Anna Klein's testimony had become the fight for the souls of all who had suffered within the walls of the Community for the Salvation of Souls, and the outcome would determine whether their torment would mean anything or would be forever hidden in the darkness of Lancaster County's dark past. The final confrontation occurred on the 12th of December, 1771, during a snowstorm that would later be remembered as one of the most severe winter storms in Lancaster County's recorded history. The storm provided the perfect cover for what William Whitaker intended to be the final elimination of all threats to his operation, a plan so ruthless and comprehensive that it revealed the true depths of the evil that had masqueraded as Christian charity for more than 20 years. Representative Hale had established a temporary headquarters at the Lancaster Courthouse, where he was coordinating with colonial marshals and local authorities to conduct a thorough investigation into the Community for the Salvation of Souls. Anna Klein's testimony, now formally recorded and corroborated by physical evidence from the incident at the Hess farm, had provided the foundation for what was becoming the largest criminal investigation in the history of colonial Pennsylvania. But William Whitaker had no intention of allowing that investigation to proceed. Drawing on the resources accumulated over decades of profitable exploitation, he had assembled a private army of criminal associates, corrupt officials, and desperate men who had been compromised by their involvement in his various enterprises. His plan was brutally simple: eliminate all witnesses, destroy all evidence, and disappear with the considerable fortune he had amassed, leaving behind only the smoldering ruins of a community that would be remembered as the victim of a tragic accident. The assault began at midnight as the snowstorm reached its peak intensity. Whitaker's forces struck simultaneously on three fronts: the courthouse, where Representative Hale was coordinating the investigation; the Hess farm, where Anna Klein was providing additional testimony; and the Community for the Salvation of Souls itself, where the remaining residents represented potential witnesses who could corroborate Anna's story. At the courthouse, William Whitaker led a group of armed men who gained entry by posing as colonial militia, arriving to assist the investigation. Their objective was to seize and destroy all documentary evidence while eliminating Representative Hale and his assistants. The plan almost succeeded. Hale was stabbed during the initial assault and would have been killed if not for the intervention of local guards, who were alerted by the screams. The attack on the Hess farm was even more violent, as Thomas Whitaker personally led an assault designed to eliminate Anna Klein and anyone who had heard her testimony. The Mennonite farmers fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by men who had been hardened by years of criminal activity. The farmhouse was set on fire during the fight, forcing the defenders to choose between being burned alive and facing Whitaker's men in open battle. But it was at the Community for the Salvation of Souls that the true monstrosity of the Whitaker family was finally revealed in all its horror. Elizabeth Whitaker, faced with the prospect of losing her life's work, decided to eliminate all remaining evidence of the family's crimes, including the 31 people who were still in the community. Her method was as cold and calculating as everything else she had done. She poisoned the evening meal with a toxic fungus she had been stockpiling for months, intending to create a tragic case of accidental food poisoning. Mrs. Whitaker prepared that final meal with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, testified Eliza Schmidt, one of only 5 residents who survived because she had refused to eat due to illness. She served the poisoned food while delivering a sermon on the redemptive power of suffering, explaining to us that our deaths would be the final act of purification that would cleanse our souls and prepare us for heaven. She seemed to genuinely believe that she was performing an act of Christian mercy. The poison began to take effect within a few hours, but Elizabeth's calculations had been flawed. The dosage was sufficient to cause excruciating illness, but not to cause immediate death, leaving most of the residents conscious and aware as they endured hours of terrible suffering. Their screams and pleas for help echoed through the chapel's corridors, creating a chorus of agony that would haunt the few survivors for the rest of their lives. As the poisoned residents writhed and died throughout that terrible night, William Whitaker returned from the failed assault on the courthouse to find his carefully constructed empire collapsing around him. Representative Hale had survived the attack and was coordinating a massive law enforcement response. Colonial militia were converging on Lancaster County from across Pennsylvania, and reports were arriving that some of his criminal associates had been killed or captured in the various assaults. Most devastating was the news that Anna Klein had not only survived the attack on the Hess farm, but had escaped with other witnesses who could corroborate her testimony. Abram Hess and 2 other Mennonites had died defending her, but their sacrifice had ensured that the evidence needed to destroy the Whitaker family would survive and reach the authorities. Faced with the complete failure of his plans, William Whitaker made a final decision that revealed the depths of his narcissism and distorted psychology. Instead of attempting to escape or negotiate some form of plea deal, he chose to turn the Community for the Salvation of Souls into a pyre that would consume all remaining evidence of his crimes, while providing him with what he saw as a martyrdom befitting his self-proclaimed status as a religious prophet. Throughout that nightmarish evening, as the poisoned residents died in agony in the dormitories above, William systematically destroyed all records of the community's operations while preparing the chapel for destruction. He soaked the wooden floors and furniture with lamp oil, arranged papers and ledgers to feed the flames, and wrote what he intended to be a final testament, explaining his actions as the inevitable result of society's failure to appreciate his visionary approach to soul-saving. "I have dedicated my life to the holy work of cleansing lost souls and restoring them to Christian virtue," William wrote in his final statement. "A corrupt world has rejected my methods because they lack the courage to admit the extreme measures necessary to purify souls defiled by sin. History will vindicate my work when future generations understand that true salvation requires the absolute surrender of the individual will to divine authority." The fire that consumed the Community for the Salvation of Souls began just before dawn on the 13th of December, 1771. As the snowstorm finally began to abate and the first light of a new day revealed the full scale of the previous night's carnage, William Whitaker died in the flames along with his brother Thomas, who had returned from the failed assault on the Hess farm to join what he saw as their final act of defiance against a world that had failed to appreciate their divine mission. Elizabeth Whitaker survived the fire, but was captured while attempting to flee with a carriage full of her research documents and personal effects. Her arrest marked the end of the Whitaker family's reign of terror, but the full scale of their crimes was only just beginning to be understood as investigators sifted through the evidence that had survived the previous night's violence. The charred ruins of the Community for the Salvation of Souls would smolder for days, the smoke visible for miles, serving as a grim monument to more than 20 years of systematic cruelty disguised as Christian charity. But even as the physical evidence of their crimes turned to ash, the testimony of survivors like Anna Klein would ensure that the horrifying legacy of the Whitaker family would not be forgotten. The battle was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The investigation that followed the destruction of the Community for the Salvation of Souls would eventually be recognized as one of the most comprehensive criminal inquiries in American colonial history up to that point. Representative Jonathan Hale, though wounded from the attack on the courthouse, oversaw a team of colonial marshals, investigators, and local authorities who worked for months to uncover the full scale of the Whitaker criminal enterprise. The evidence they discovered was staggering in its scope and horrifying in its detail. Financial records recovered from William Whitaker's other properties revealed that the Community for the Salvation of Souls had generated over £32,000 in profits between 1748 and 1771, an enormous sum, representing the monetary value of 23 years of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and systematic fraud. This money came from multiple sources: fees paid by families, profits from the sale of goods produced by forced labor, payments from the network of wealthy clients who had purchased access to the residence, and proceeds from the sale of people to plantations and other criminal enterprises. Even more disturbing were Elizabeth Whitaker's research documents, which had survived both her attempts to preserve them and the fire that consumed the chapel. These papers provided a detailed record of her systematic research into psychological manipulation and physical abuse, documenting the methods she had developed to break her victims' resistance and maintain control over them. Her notes read like a manual for human exploitation, written with the clinical detachment of a scientist documenting experimental procedures. Mrs. Whitaker's records revealed a level of systematic cruelty that shocked even seasoned investigators. Representative Hale wrote in his final report, "She had documented the psychological and physical responses of each individual to various forms of abuse, noting which methods were most effective on different personality types. Her work represented a deliberate and scientific approach to human degradation, unlike anything we had encountered in our investigation of other criminal enterprises." The testimony of survivors, led by Anna Klein's courageous decision to speak publicly about her experiences, provided the human context for the documentary evidence. Anna's story of her more than 20 years at the Community for the Salvation of Souls became the foundation for understanding how the Whitakers had managed to sustain their operation for so long while convincing both their victims and community members that they were conducting legitimate religious work. Anna Klein's testimony was crucial, not just for its factual content, but for its demonstration of how intelligent, capable people could be systematically broken down through psychological manipulation, disguised as spiritual guidance, noted Dr. Elias Thorne, a physician and early researcher into what would later be understood as psychological trauma. Her story showed how religious authority could be weaponized to justify the most extreme forms of abuse, and how victims could be convinced to participate in their own exploitation through carefully constructed systems of reward and punishment. The trial of Elizabeth Whitaker, the only surviving member of the family, became a sensational event that drew attention from across the American colonies and as far away as England. Legal observers were fascinated by the question of how to prosecute someone whose crimes had been committed under the guise of religious charity, while medical experts debated whether Elizabeth's apparent absence of normal emotional responses indicated mental illness or simply extreme moral depravity. Elizabeth herself seemed genuinely perplexed by the charges against her, maintaining throughout the trial that her work had been scientifically valuable and morally justified. She expressed regret only for the premature termination of her research, lamenting that she had been unable to complete her studies of human psychological responses to various therapeutic interventions. Her testimony revealed a mind so completely disconnected from normal human empathy that even her own defense attorneys struggled to present her as anything other than a monster. "I dedicated my life to understanding the human mind and developing effective methods for correcting moral defects," Elizabeth testified at her trial. "Every person who entered our community was lost, corrupted by sin. My methods may have seemed harsh to those who lack scientific training, but they were based on careful observation and systematic experimentation. Those under my care received treatment specifically designed for their individual psychological needs." The trial lasted for 6 weeks and drew crowds from across the region, many of whom came simply to see the woman who had become known as the She-Devil of Lancaster. Elizabeth was ultimately found guilty on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, fraud, and what the court called criminal conspiracy to commit acts of moral depravity. She was sentenced to death, becoming one of the first women in the history of colonial Pennsylvania to receive a capital sentence for crimes committed under the guise of religious authority. Elizabeth Whitaker was executed by hanging on the 10th of August, 1774, remaining calm and convinced of the scientific value of her work to the very end. Her final statement, read by a minister because she refused to speak publicly, continued to defend her methods as necessary innovations in the field of soul-saving that had been misunderstood by those who lacked the courage to face the realities of human nature. The broader investigation revealed that the Whitaker network had extended far beyond Lancaster County, involving corrupt officials, criminal organizations, and wealthy individuals throughout Pennsylvania and Maryland. More than 30 people were eventually prosecuted in connection with the case, including magistrates, ministers, and business leaders who had knowingly participated in or benefited from the Whitaker criminal enterprise. The scandal led to significant reforms in the oversight of religious communities throughout the colony of Pennsylvania, establishing new requirements for inspection, documentation, and external review of institutions claiming to provide moral or medical guidance. The Whitaker reforms, as they became known, served as a model for similar legislation in other colonies and helped to establish the principle that religious authority could not be a shield for criminal activity. Anna Klein, whose courage in testifying had been crucial to exposing the full scale of the Whitakers' crimes, became a celebrated advocate for institutional reform and support for survivors of abuse. She married Abram Hess's son, Jacob, in 1775 and spent the rest of her life working with Mennonite organizations to help others who had been harmed by similar communities. Her memoirs, published in 1782, became one of the first detailed accounts of systematic psychological abuse and helped to establish legal precedents for prosecuting crimes committed under the guise of religious authority. The physical site of the Community for the Salvation of Souls was never rebuilt. The charred ruins were left to decay as a reminder of the horrors that had occurred there, and local residents reported that the property remained unsold for decades because no one wanted to live on land associated with such terrible crimes. The foundation stones and cellar walls gradually disappeared as local residents salvaged them for other construction projects, as if the community were trying to erase any physical trace of the Whitakers' legacy. But the psychological impact of the Whitaker case extended far beyond Lancaster County. The revelation that respected religious leaders could systematically abuse their authority to commit monstrous crimes shattered many people's faith in institutional religion and charitable organizations. Churches across Pennsylvania found themselves facing increased scrutiny and demands for transparency, while families became far more cautious about placing troubled relatives in private communities. The case also had significant legal implications that stretched far into the future. The prosecution's successful argument that religious authority could not provide immunity from criminal prosecution established important precedents that would be cited in future cases involving abuse by religious leaders. The detailed documentation of the Whitakers' methods also provided early insights into what would later be recognized as systematic psychological manipulation and trauma-based control techniques. Perhaps most importantly, the Whitaker case demonstrated how easily a community could be deceived by individuals who understood how to manipulate religious and social expectations. William, Elizabeth, and Thomas Whitaker had succeeded for more than 20 years, not because they were exceptionally brilliant criminals, but because they understood that people wanted to believe in the possibility of moral redemption and were willing to overlook disturbing signs if those signs contradicted their fundamental beliefs about Christian charity. The Whitaker case taught us that evil often succeeds not through deception, but through the willingness of good people to ignore evidence that contradicts their cherished beliefs. Dr. Thorne observed in his analysis of the case, the residents of Lancaster County were not stupid or gullible. They were decent people who wanted to believe that communities claiming to serve God's will were actually doing God's work. The Whitakers exploited that desire for moral certainty to commit crimes that would have been impossible without the protection of religious authority. The investigation also revealed troubling questions about how many other communities might have been operating under similar guises of religious charity while engaging in systematic abuse. Representative Hale's team identified at least 8 other communities in Pennsylvania and neighboring colonies that had suspicious patterns similar to those observed at the Community for the Salvation of Souls. While none of these other communities were proven to be as comprehensively criminal as the Whitaker operation, several were found to be engaging in financial fraud, inappropriate treatment methods, or exploitation of their members. The legacy of the Whitakers' crimes continued to influence American colonial society in ways that went far beyond the immediate legal and regulatory changes their exposure had prompted. The case became a touchstone for discussions about religious authority, institutional oversight, and the vulnerability of marginalized populations to systematic abuse. It also provided early documentation of techniques that would later be recognized as central to understanding how totalitarian systems maintain control over their victims. For the survivors of the Community for the Salvation of Souls, the end of the Whitaker operation marked the beginning of a long and difficult recovery process that would continue for the rest of their lives. Many of those who were rescued from the community struggled with what would now be recognized as severe psychological trauma, while others found it difficult to reintegrate into normal social relationships after years of systematic abuse. The survivors of the Whitaker community carried scars that never fully healed, Anna Klein wrote in her memoirs. We had been taught to distrust our own perceptions, to doubt our own worth, and to accept suffering as evidence of spiritual progress. Learning how to think and feel for ourselves again was a process that took many years, and some of us never fully succeeded in reclaiming the people we had been before our captivity. The financial impact of the Whitaker case was also significant, as the Colonial Council of Pennsylvania eventually paid substantial reparations to the families whose loved ones had been harmed by the community. These payments, totaling over £5,000, represented one of the largest expenditures by the colonial government for victim compensation in American colonial history up to that point, and established precedents for governmental responsibility in cases where officials had failed to prevent systematic abuse. The broader cultural impact of the Whitaker case echoed through American colonial society for decades, influencing literature, journalism, and social reform movements in ways that are still visible today. The case provided material for numerous novels and articles that helped to shape the public's understanding of how institutional abuse works and how communities can be complicit in enabling systematic cruelty through their unwillingness to question authority. As the years passed and the initial shock of the Whitaker revelations faded, the case took on almost mythical dimensions in the folklore of Lancaster County. Stories of the Community for the Salvation of Souls were passed down through generations, often embellished with supernatural elements that obscured the very real human evil that had actually occurred. Some versions claimed that the Whitaker Chapel was haunted by the spirits of those who had been murdered, while others suggested that William Whitaker had made a pact with demonic forces to maintain his power over his victims. These supernatural interpretations, while understandable as attempts to make sense of seemingly incomprehensible evil, actually served to diminish the true horror of what had happened at the Community for the Salvation of Souls. The real story of how 3 intelligent, educated people had systematically destroyed hundreds of lives while convincing themselves and their community that they were performing a sacred work was far more disturbing than any ghost story, because it demonstrated the capacity for evil that exists within supposedly normal human beings. The Whitaker case stands as a permanent reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often not the obviously deranged individuals who commit violent crimes in a fit of rage, but the methodical, systematic abusers who understand how to manipulate social institutions and moral frameworks to protect themselves while destroying their victims. William, Elizabeth, and Thomas Whitaker succeeded for more than 20 years because they understood that communities wanted to believe in salvation, that families would pay almost any price to avoid public shame, and that religious authority provided an almost impenetrable shield from outside scrutiny. Their story is a cautionary tale that remains relevant to this day. When institutions claim moral authority while operating in secret, when families are prevented from maintaining contact with loved ones in treatment, and when victims are taught to interpret their suffering as evidence of spiritual progress, The conditions exist for systematic abuse that can continue for years without detection. The Whitaker family's reign of terror ended in fire and death in December of 1771, but their legacy continues to influence the way American society thinks about institutional oversight, religious authority, and the protection of vulnerable populations. Their crimes were ultimately exposed and punished, but only after they had destroyed hundreds of lives and demonstrated how easily evil can hide behind the guises of Christian charity and moral reform. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying monsters are often not supernatural beings or obviously deranged killers, but the ordinary people who discover that they can commit unspeakable acts while convincing themselves and others that they are serving a higher purpose. The Whitakers believed to the very end that their work had been scientifically valuable and morally justified, a delusion that made them far more dangerous than criminals who at least understood that they were doing evil. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or do you think there might have been other communities from that era that operated under similar guises of religious charity while committing systematic abuse? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on how communities can protect themselves from predators who understand how to manipulate moral authority. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of horror from America's hidden past, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another chapter from the shadows of American history that the official records have tried to forget.